Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to Friday Fellowship. To begin our meeting, we're going to take a moment to make ourselves present to God and to this space.
Hi everyone, my name is Thumim and I'm a senior at Pomona and this is Claremont Christian Fellowship. Welcome to everybody and good job on making it through the week. Also, this is my first time emceeing, so if I stumble over my words, you will know why. Claremont Christian Fellowship is a community that is open for everyone and we welcome everyone. And here are some of our announcements for today. So the first one is after CCF, after the fellowship is done, we will be having a Zoom hangout. So please come to that. It will be a fun time. We will all be together and in community. And this week is a little special. We will be having a Q&A with our speaker for the first part of the hangout. And after the Q&A, we will be playing Among Us, which we played last week. And it's a game that's kind of like Mafia, where you're trying to figure out who is the suspicious one among you. And it's a really fun time. So we hope you can join us to that. And the second announcement is the workouts with Matt. These happen every Saturday from 1 to 2:30 p.m. And so they will be happening tomorrow as well. And look out for the Zoom link in the CCF chat or the private Facebook group. And if you're not already on these, please let us know to be added. And this workout is a really fun time to just get together, get sweaty together, and have a very affirming and encouraging time working out. Matt is always a really kind presence to be around. And our third announcement is the Zoom study sessions we have. And these are on Sundays, 8 to 10 p.m., also over Zoom. And the link will also be in the Facebook chat and the Facebook group and the Messenger chat. And this is a really fun time to just be together and do tomato timers and try and be undistracted and do work. I went to a few of these last week and they kind of really helped me get things done. So we hope to see you all at one or all of these three events. And now we will be moving to a time of meet and greet. So please put in the comments your name, school, year, and one thing that you're really excited about for October. It's crazy that it's already October, but maybe let's focus on the things we're excited about for this month.
All right. Oh, we're very small right now. Okay. So tonight we're starting a new talk series called Shalom and the News. And we want to be addressing some of the things that are happening in our world and looking at a Christ-like response to them. This next coming week, we're really excited to have Reverend Dr. Alexia Salvatierra come and speak to us. Alexia is an activist, an author, a professor, and just a powerful presence in person. She's someone that I find very inspirational. She'll be speaking about how we can seek shalom through the ballot box.
For our talk tonight, we are excited to have Matt Bush speak for us. Matt hails from Oakland, California, and graduated from Pomona in 2011. He was involved in the fellowship as a student and served as a leader in our group. He majored in economics and sociology and also holds a master's in development studies. He currently lives in the Bay Area with his wife, Lisa, who is also a Pomona alum. Scroll up. And he works as a people and culture consultant. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Matt, and for taking the time to share with us.
Hey everyone, thanks Chris and Lorraine, and thank you all for opening up your space to me. I'll do my best to respect it as we go along. I'm super excited to be here, even going through the comments, seeing some of the young people currently in the fellowship, as well as even some of my former classmates in the Claremont colleges are present as well. And before I get started though, there's something that I feel that I need to begin this conversation with, is actually saying, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to the students who are currently in the fellowship right now who are watching this virtually. I'm sorry for the ways that I and my generation have failed you. You deserve to be on campus right now with your friends. You deserve to be enjoying a safe space as you transition from childhood to adulthood. You deserve to be breathing air that isn't polluted by climate change-driven wildfires. And while my generation is not solely responsible for all of these things, we've had our time. We've had time to elect better officials, to push for better policies, to start fewer terrible tech companies. And you do not deserve to inherit the consequences of things that we did not do. And for that, I'm sorry. I have tremendous faith in your generation, in your resolve, your strength, and your creativity. And I will continue doing everything I can to work on my generation. But you're not here to listen to some old Pomona fogey apologize to you, at least not all night. We're here to talk about Black lives and the role that we as followers of Jesus can play in pursuing Black liberation. But before I actually dive into that, I think it's important, and if you want to understand my perspective on the intersections of faith and Black liberation, you need to understand a bit more of my background. My story with evangelical Christianity begins in college. As Lorraine mentioned, I was a member and a leader within their fellowship at Pomona College. It was there that I was exposed to this whole new world of things I didn't understand before around how Jesus calls us to be servants of justice and peace and serving the marginalized among us. I learned so much about how the gospel spoke to my pre-existing passions towards social justice. If you're curious about exactly how old I am, well, this is how old Audrey was when I was a senior. So for those of you current students who know Audrey as all grown up now, that's how big she was when I was there. After I graduated from Pomona, I got a job back in the Bay Area, but I really missed working in college and student ministry. I wanted to stay involved in the process of forging young adults who are passionate about transforming the world into a more just place. So I became a volunteer at the university at UC Berkeley. That's me amongst some of the great students that I met and got to work on their campus up here in the area that I grew up in. After a year and a half of volunteering with IV at Cal, I felt called to international ministry. So I moved to Rio de Janeiro and volunteered with Brazilian grassroots children's ministries. I also joined an evangelical Brazilian church and lived 7 of the best months of my life there. After leaving Rio, I returned to the Bay Area and became an official staff member of InterVarsity at UC Berkeley. And everything at that time had been great. Evangelical Christianity was such a part of my adult life. I was all in on it. I was making it such a central part of my identity and had had so many formative experiences within that space already by the time I was like 5-6 years out of college. What had drawn me to it in the first place kept me in it. I loved how passionate we were about loving others, about pursuing justice, about feeling affirmed as a Black man that I was seen for all of who I was and that people wanted to advocate for justice for people who look like me as well. And I thought that we as evangelical Christians were all in it together. After a year on staff at UC Berkeley, I left to go actually start graduate school. I also left because I turned out that I'm a terrible fundraiser, but it was mostly the grad school thing, I assure you. And after I left for grad school, a few short months after leaving InterVarsity, an absolute bombshell dropped. InterVarsity made the unilateral decision to terminate any employee that supported marriage equality. InterVarsity had long had a position of how they viewed marriage, but they still welcomed staff to continue on arguably the largest theological debate of our generation, which is marriage equality. It allowed us to go through the nuances and the messiness of it, to still be affirming staff to LGBTQ students who were still seeking Jesus nonetheless. But all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they decided the time for that was up. And many of my friends who were still on staff found themselves out of a job. And while we're on this topic, many of you current students at the Claremont colleges are probably too young to remember when this happened, or were not here when it did happen. But I wanted to take this opportunity to let you know that y'all have some real ones in Chris and Lorraine, because they remember what this purge was like. And you have leaders who stood by their convictions and stood by their students and did what was right and chose to de-affiliate and keep their ministry going in the vision that they had for it, which is why they're some of my formative spiritual leaders that I still rock with today. This is a very rattling experience, seeing the organization I trusted actually make this decision that impacted me, my friends, and the students that we were ministering to. It was rattling, but it still didn't prepare me for the things that were to come. In 2016, white evangelicals played a prominent role in electing Donald Trump as president of the United States. We're talking about a man who spent his entire life exploiting or ignoring the poor, a man who bragged about sexually assaulting women, a man who had cheated on every wife he had ever had, a man with a decades-long track record of racism. Denouncing and opposing this person for a follower of Jesus, I thought would have been like dunking on a 5-foot hoop. Like, all right, we got this in the bag. This seems like he's checking off all the boxes. But instead, what I learned is that white evangelicals showed that they were either able to overlook a lot or secretly super down with a lot of things that I at least thought a follower of Jesus should not be down with. But it didn't end there for me. Back in my adoptive home of Brazil, Brazilians in 2018 elected far-right, fascist-leaning Jair Bolsonaro, who also has a long track record of misogyny and vicious anti-Black racism. He was carried ultimately by strong Christian support in Brazil. I also learned that the church I was a member of there, almost its entire membership, vocally supported Bolsonaro during his campaign. So here I was, in a span of 2 years, evangelicals, the country I was from, evangelicals in the organization I dedicated most of my adult life to, evangelicals in the country I had made my adoptive home, all sided with xenophobia, supported ending or cutting programs that were meant to help the poor, and made the world generally less safe for marginalized peoples. It was the most rattling wake-up call that left me absolutely shattered. I knew even some time ago that not all evangelicals shared the same convictions and views towards social justice as those around me did, but the scale to which they didn't was genuinely shocking to me. I didn't realize how willing evangelical institutions and populations were to attach their names to these movements. Spaces, leaders, organizations that I once looked for its inspiration and safety didn't feel safe or real anymore. I frankly didn't know who to trust. And this especially hurt as a Black man worshiping next to people who claim to affirm my humanity, my dignity, justice for me, people who look like me, and then in private supported those who oppose all of those things. Just as many of my brothers and sisters who are LGBTQ, female, and immigrants also felt in their own ways during this time. Years later, I and many of my friends who are deep in the evangelical life are still picking up the pieces, existing in a partially reconstructed state of some kind, going through the process of decolonizing our own personal faiths while still doing our best to pursue the justice that we were called to fight for in the first place. All these topics on the screen right here before you are things that deserve their own speaking series, but I'm actually not going to go into any of them in any considerable depth tonight. But in my mind, whenever there is a fight to end any of these things, Followers of Jesus were supposed to be on the front lines to pursue them, not on the opposite side. So the question I have is, how can we reject theology that aligns with persecution and intolerance and subscribe to one that pursues justice and inclusion? What would this reclamation and reimagination process look like, specifically when it comes to advocating for Black lives? And that's where I wanted to begin really in earnest with today. I'm not here to talk about why we should care about Black lives or why they matter. If that's a question you still need answering, it's one I recommend looking into for sure, but I'm operating under the assumption that you already do. Instead, I'm here to talk about how we can move from caring to acting in the radical ways that Jesus calls his followers to act. The scripture I wanted to begin with today is actually Mark chapter 10, verses 17 through 31. I'll read them as we go through. As he was setting out on his journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him being Jesus, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not defraud. Honor your father and mother." And he said to him, "Teacher, all of these I have kept from my youth." And Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said to him, "You lack one thing. Go, sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me." Disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. And Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, "How difficult it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God." I don't want to mislead you by implying that this passage specifically is directly talking about racial justice, because it's not. This passage is often used as a means of talking about financial stewardship, or yet another example of how you cannot serve two masters, the two masters usually being God and money. But I think that it is a helpful analogy that can help illustrate a great need when it comes to the issue of advocating for Black liberation as well. This call to give to the poor overall is very consistent with the central message of Jesus' ministry. In Matthew 25, for example, he actually explicitly says that the kingdom of heaven is for those who feed, clothe, comfort, care for the marginalized, and is not for those who don't. He then says, if you want to rock with me, this is what it looks like. This is who you have to be caring for. This is what you have to be focusing on. What this rich man stands to gain in return in this example is treasure in heaven. We're talking about the ultimate reward that as followers we are led to believe is more important than anything we could imagine in this world or the next. And even knowing that, this rich man cannot bring himself to do it. It's a helpful analogy because when it comes to justice, it's a similar dilemma. Even when it comes to something we deeply care about, like ending racism, people of privilege can struggle to pay the costs of doing what they are called to do to pursue these passions. And I want to break down three central things that we can take away from this passage and apply it to our struggle for Black liberation. The first point I have is that our knowledge must match the complexity of the problem. If we seek to solve the complex problems such as racism or white supremacy, we must cultivate a knowledge of what these issues are in the first place if we are to have any hope of solving them. The rich man actually starts his engagement with Jesus off on the right foot. He humbly seeks new and deeper information rather than being complacent to what he already knows. He knows the commandments, he's followed them, but he still is humble enough to run up to Jesus, to kneel and to ask, what more do I need to know? What more do I need to do? And we must have the same approach when it comes to understanding racism. I want to share this quote from James Baldwin's work, Notes of a Native Son. "I don't think the Negro problem can be discussed coherently without bearing in mind its context being the history, traditions, customs, the moral assumptions and preoccupations of the country. In short, the general social fabric. Appearances to the contrary. No one in America escapes its effects, and everyone in America bears some responsibility for it." There is a book called Black Power written by Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton, and in it they distinguish between individual racism, individuals acting against other individuals in a harmful way, and institutional racism, collective groups, populations acting against the interests of collective groups. And it's the latter that most people have a difficult time understanding when it comes to its depth, its length, and how deeply ingrained in the fabric of our society racism really is. And I can give you just a few examples of what this looks like. Many white Americans specifically can trace their current familial wealth back to very specific acts within US history. Take, for example, the Homestead Act. After stealing land from indigenous peoples west of the Mississippi, the United States government gave away what ended up being 10% of the total land area of the United States, 270 million acres of land to 1.6 million almost exclusively white homesteaders for absolutely free or very low cost for them to cultivate and develop land and earn a living off of it. Compare that to the only promise ever given to emancipated slaves, which were 40 acres and a mule upon emancipation. So the slaves were actually never given anything to start building wealth off of. They never received the 40 acres or a mule. In fact, the only reparations paid in that time were actually to former slave masters due to loss of property. Take another example like the National Housing Act. During the Great Depression, there was an effort to try to create more opportunities for home ownership for people. And the federal government started subsidizing low-cost loans. However, due to segregationist policies such as redlining, which is essentially a practice of not giving out loans or assistance to people who are within certain areas of the map, usually Black neighborhoods, the Federal Housing Administration refused to insure mortgages in or near Black neighborhoods. Consequently, Black neighborhoods across the nation remain underdeveloped and uninvested in. And given that today, property taxes are what fund public schools, predominantly Black schools to this day remain disproportionately under-resourced. Or take another bill that a lot of white families can trace their familial wealth back to, the GI Bill, which aimed to help World War II veterans have a solid foundation upon returning to the United States with things like low-cost mortgages, subsidized college tuition, and other financial assistance. But over 95% of the World War II veterans that actually benefited from the GI Bill were white. Almost all of the 1.2 million Black veterans who fought or participated in World War II were denied home loans that they should have been entitled to by the GI Bill. And due to, once again, to segregation laws, the only college options available to them were underfunded and unaccredited Black colleges. And the unaccredited part made so that they were ineligible for subsidized college tuition. These are just 3 examples I can think of. And all of these acts provided intragenerational wealth and social mobility for white people, but were explicitly made unavailable to Black people. The more you learn about the history of Black people in America, the more you'll begin to feel a lot like the rich man did in the story. Oh man, I have to sell everything, then I gotta give it all away, then I gotta join your crew. Like, when does all this end? Just bad news after bad news. I was happier before I asked. I was happier not knowing this information. And when you learn more about this history, you're not always gonna like what you find. You may be devastated by anger and sadness. You're not always gonna be sure what to do with the information that you receive. And even if you are, you might not be sure you're prepared to act on it. But it's where it all has to start. And for you, the students who are still in college right now, the Claremont colleges, you actually are in a remarkable position right now in these formative educational years where you can integrate this learning into your journey. Instead of taking that class to get an easy A, which I did when I was there, I took a few classes to fulfill some prereqs. Instead, try taking a sociology class, Black history class, or something that will help ingrain this knowledge in your formative years. There is a lot that you can do in where you currently are to do that. I also want to acknowledge that conversations of racism primarily are framed in a Black versus white way. And I know that can sometimes be overly reductionist and not helpful. So if you don't identify as either Black or white, I wanted to also encourage you to find specific resources for your identity. And I wanted to shout out one of my good friends, Bianca Mabute Lue, and also a coworker of mine from InterVarsity who also endured the same purge I referenced earlier. And she specializes, she's currently a PhD student at Rice University, getting her PhD in sociology, and she specializes in Black Asian solidarity. So if you wanted specific things that are based on your identity, because you don't see yourself in the Black-white binary where we talk about racism, I want to encourage you to seek out those things as well. And cultivating knowledge is the foundation for advocating for Black lives, which leads to the next point that comes when you have that knowledge. And that's understanding and leveraging your privilege. So broadly, what is privilege? I actually believe that British psychologist John Amici has a very helpful way of framing it. He says that it's not what most people imagine privilege to be, and it's not immediate unearned riches and tangible benefits for anyone who has it automatically. But privilege is actually more about the absence of inconvenience, the absence of an impediment or a challenge. If you have it, you don't always notice it. But if you don't have it, it affects almost everything you do. There are so many everyday ways in which the lives of those without privilege are made harder that those with privilege can take for granted. And the more you learn about our history and our existing systems, the more you also understand your position in it and its significance. An easy example to understand about privilege is, being born to a rich family versus a poor family. You can understand how being born in a rich family has inherent advantages. And there are some less obvious ones, like male privilege. For example, when I leave someplace at night, I just get to walk home. I can put my headphones in, leisurely stroll on home, and I'm gonna get home safely. But the more I learn about the reality, and the one that I live in is not the same one that my sisters do, who have to be looking over their shoulder, who can't have both headphones in, who are not safe always walking alone at night, the more I understand the significance of my privilege that I have, and how outrageous it is that they cannot have the same safety that's so fundamentally assumed for me. The rich man in the story is given a way in which he can leverage his privilege. It's an extreme way, of course, but the wealth that he holds can do so much to take care of the people that Jesus and his followers are trying to help. He can help in ways that those around him can't, and then he can join the movement himself. And what's really revealed in this process is that the rich man, at the very least, understands that there is a difference between having money and not having money. Otherwise, he would have said yes to this offer. But it was a privilege he wanted to keep. He did not want to be poor. And that's always a tell for when you have an inequality that needs fixing. If other people are in circumstances beyond their control, which you yourself would not accept. There is an old but famous experiment run by a woman named Jane Elliott, where she simply asks the white students in her classroom who among them would be happy to be treated the same way that the black people in society were treated. And nobody stood up. And in that moment, she said this. The fact that nobody was standing up, that says very plainly that you know what's happening. You know you don't want it for you. I want to know why you're so willing to accept it or allow it to happen to others. I like stories because stories help us understand complex issues. And I wanted to tell you another one. This one takes place on May 9th, 1977. On this day, there was a student sit-in protest at Stanford University. The student sit-in protests were quite common on these days due to either the Vietnam War, civil rights, etc. This particular one was about apartheid in South Africa. And my father actually was a part of this sit-in protest. He was a Stanford student at the time. I believe he would have been a third year. And during the sit-in protest, the police came and they said, anyone who is still here in 5 minutes is getting arrested. My father stood up and left in that moment. Some background information about my father and this decision. Our ancestors were brought to this country as slaves. After emancipation, they became sharecroppers in the South. My grandfather moved to Berkeley, California as part of the Great Migration to work in the shipyard and eventually construction. My grandmother was orphaned when she was only 10 years old and spent her childhood working in a boarding home, couldn't go to school. So my father and his siblings were the first people in the history of our family on this land with the opportunity to get a bachelor's degree. They didn't come from money. They didn't have a safety net. They had to earn and fight their way there and get scholarships. And simply, he could not afford to get arrested, expelled, and lose his scholarship because there was no alternative option waiting for him. Those who did stay got arrested and they still had to go to jail, and it stinks to go to jail. But the risk of staying getting arrested for them was so much smaller than it was for my father. They had the privilege of doing something, of making a decision that my father simply could not afford to make. And within this story, I think there's some key takeaways around the significance of privilege and what it means for us in these decisions. The first one, the same action can have different implications for different people. Be mindful of this asymmetry And if you know there is something where the result will be more favorable for you than a more marginalized person, you can use your privilege to do something that someone else might not be able to afford to do. These different implications also shape our worldviews. I also want to point out that Jesus calls us to fight for more just systems, even if we benefit from, or at least aren't adversely impacted by, the current systems as they are. When the rich man came up to him, Jesus didn't say, looks like you kind of already got money. I think you're good. Like, you can just kind of go back and do your thing. No, it's actually, there is an inequality that we live in right now. Use what you have to address it, and then be among us. I know it's funny, you were playing Among Us later today, but yes, and then join us and then be a part of this movement. Just because the system of the economic system there had benefited this person does not mean that Jesus was content with just letting him ride it out with his privilege and comfort. And then finally, if we see circumstances that we ourselves would not accept, ridding our society of these circumstances is how we love our neighbors who are caught in them. Therein lies the call. Through his 3-ish year ministry, Jesus called for a society where people didn't hoard wealth, where people weren't socially excluded. And so what does this kind of radical call of big systemic change mean for us as his followers? And for that, I know this is pretty academic, but y'all are college students, I figure you can handle this. I want to share this little longer quote from Paulo Freire's seminal work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's a bit wordy, but I'll break it down afterwards. Any attempt to soften the power of the oppressor in deference to the weakness of the oppressed almost always manifests itself in the form of false generosity. Indeed, the attempt never goes beyond this. In order to have the continued opportunity to express their generosity, the oppressors must perpetuate injustice as well. An unjust social order is the permanent fount of this generosity. True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and subdued, the rejects of life, to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, need be extended less and less in supplication, so that more and more they become human hands which work and working transform the world. We have this dichotomy of false and true generosity. And when it comes to advocating for Black lives or economic inequality or racial inequality, what does false generosity look like? It can be, for example, saying something like, I'll volunteer at a soup kitchen every few months, but I will also oppose the plans for low-income housing in my area. It can look like billionaires that give money to philanthropic causes while perpetually opposing legislation that would address the root causes of the things that they donate to. It can mean something like saying, like, I'll retweet a Black Lives Matter thing, sure, but I'll oppose things like affirmative action because why should my chances be reduced? False generosity merely softens the oppression and persecution that people feel. It does nothing to address the underlying causes and serves an ulterior motive to make you feel better about yourself. True generosity is radical and selfless. It's done with the intent of creating sustainable, transformative change. My first job out of college, when I was volunteering with University at Cal, my full-time profession actually was working at a nonprofit called First Place for Youth. It's a transitional housing program for foster children. And I'll never forget, my boss told me that our dream was to work ourselves out of a job, that the work that we did for the young people transitioning out of foster care would no longer be necessary because the root inequalities that cause their marginalization would be gone. And I tried to always hold on to that mentality as much as possible. We don't want our jobs to exist. We don't want to put people in situations where they rely on our generosity. And that radical transformation of true generosity is what Jesus ultimately throughout his gospel calls us towards. It's towards a big change, challenging the institutions as they are, not selling for the status quo, but adding a Band-Aid here and there. So this call to move from an endless cycle of injustice and false generosity and toward the destruction of underlying causes that necessitate charity in the first place, and addressing the systemic brokenness and inequality in this way does require, at times, a degree of conflict. This is the next point. A few years ago, not very long, maybe 4 years ago, I was in an airport flying home. I don't even remember where I was coming from. I just remember being in an airport. And I was coming out of one of those shops where you buy like snacks or drinks, whatever in the airport. I'm well through security at this point. But I'm stopped by an airport security guard as I'm leaving the store. And he says, hey, sorry, I need to search you. And he goes through my bag, pats my pockets. I think it seemed pretty clear that he thought I might have taken something from the store. And then after inconveniencing me and frisking me in front of the entire airport, he then said that I could go. I took a few steps, and shortly after, I was approached by a white man who said, like, hey man, just wanted you to know I saw what happened and want to let you know that that's totally not cool. It was a nice thing to do. It's more than most people would have done. It's more than most people did. And it is more than nothing. But it also was kind of having your cake and eating it too. This man managed to avoid the discomfort that confronting the security guard at that moment would have caused him, but also made sure I knew that he wasn't cool with it, which I'm sure made him feel better about the whole thing. The profiling wasn't called out. The harassment wasn't called out. The security guard went about his day with no consequence, and presumably at some point continued on his track of harassing other people of color later. It's tempting for people of privilege to keep their heads down until the heat dies down when there's something happening around them, only acting or saying something when there won't be any retribution or negative consequence to them personally. Change happens in general too slowly or not at all when our strategy is to wait for the costs of acting to come within our comfort zone. Instead, we need to be proactive about expanding our comfort zone to meet the cost. But as it turns out, when it comes to racial justice, this is much easier in theory than it is in practice. More academic work. This book, Two-Faced Racism by sociologists Leslie Peek and Joe Fegan, studies 620 journals of different racial events reported by white college students at 28 universities in the United States. Basically, white students volunteered their experience and testimony of racist things they had seen in public and private and what they did in that moment. It seeks to comprehend how white students specifically think in racial terms by analyzing their reported events around racism. And here are some of the things they found in their research. They found that a vast majority of white students do not criticize other white people's racism. They typically ignore it, tolerate it, or even encourage it. They also found, sorry, my cat loves being the star of the show. They also found that on rare occasions when white people did call out racism, they are frequently socially punished or scolded by it. Those that did call out racism behind closed doors reported having to work up the courage to do it, knowing that doing that would disrupt the white comfort their peers were accustomed to maintaining in the absence of people of color. And they found that most reported instances of racism that were called out also were done so in a public setting. Ultimately, the key findings were that it was the public nature of racist performance that was framed as the problem, not racism in general or systemic dominance of white people, but the same racist comments or behavior that they tolerated behind closed doors became a problem when they were public instead. Thus, the problem wasn't racism. The problem was failure to perform publicly as being non-racist. There is a lot of other sociological research that finds similar things. Actually, the current president of the American Sociological Association, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, in his work, Racism Without Racist, found that overall people were really good at saying that they condemned racism in general, but consistently refused to ever label anything or any person as racist. As soon as you try to label something as racist, people start demanding all kinds of proof. That's because calling something racist is deeply uncomfortable for people. It's one of the worst things you can call someone, which is why people demand proof so they can be super sure before they will do it. Which is how you come up with all these terms that don't mean anything like racially charged, because the idea of calling out racism is so uncomfortable. Even if we say we don't like it or oppose it, when it comes to the courage of denouncing it when it happens, that's much harder for people to do. In short, addressing racism is usually secondary to maintain the comfort of the privilege. Just as it was with the rich man in the story, the goal of attaining righteousness to gain the kingdom of heaven was secondary to his earthly comfort. And this is what has to change as followers of Jesus. We are called to stretch beyond our comfort, to really be sacrificial and bold and radical in these ways. As Lorraine said, I'm an economics major, or I was. I don't really do a lot of econ now. But for those of you who are econ majors, you'll recognize this term. For those of you who are not, you might not. But basically, the concept of Pareto optimality is a state of being where no one's well-being could be improved without making someone else's worse. So for example, let's say there are $10 in the whole world, and me, Chris, and Lorraine are the only 3 people in this world. And we go through a process of distributing the money between the 3 of us. We get to the point where I have $2, Chris has 4, Lorraine has 4. So all $10 are distributed. And then they say, well, how can we get Matt more money? He only has 2. The only way you could give me more money is by taking money away from Chris and Lorraine. So when you're in a Pareto optimal state, it means that someone else's well-being cannot be improved without the expense of someone else's. But I have news for you. In the United States, we do not live in the Pareto optimal society. There is potential for better well-being that we are leaving on the table. In the majority of society, the privileged is okay with this untapped potential because the people who have the most to gain from it are the marginalized, as well as an underlying and irrational fear that the gains from the marginalized will come at the expense of the privileged. In other words, they believe we are in a Pareto optimal state, and if you're going to give more things to people of color in terms of rights, equity, and whatnot, it will come at the expense of what they currently already have. Hence the phrase, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. But if you think about it practically, if you took actions to make Black people feel safe around law enforcement, would that make you feel less safe around law enforcement? If you took actions to make Black schools better, would that all of a sudden make non-Black schools worse? The truth is that it is more than possible to improve the quality of life and safety for Black people without making anyone else's life any worse. And this is not just theoretical, it's also empirical. There's empirical evidence that, for example, in workplaces, when you focus on improving the well-being of Black women specifically, the well-being of everyone else improves as well. So this liberation, this fight for equity does not come at the expense of the privilege. It makes us all better. And then looking at this point now, going from Pareto optimality, and it's that the righteous fight is not always the easy fight. American evangelicals have a long-standing track record of, quite frankly, picking easy fights. Waging war against marriage equality, for example, has historically been an easy fight because of heteronormativity. Most people in power, almost everyone, a majority of the population is cisgender and heterosexual. Therefore, there's a lot of institutional support behind heteronormativity. Being indifferent or antagonistic towards Black Lives Matter or civil rights is also an easy stance to take because the power of white supremacy. Because of white supremacy and the fact that an overwhelming majority of people in power and the majority of the population is white. And I'm not even making an argument regarding whether these positions are wrong. I'm not even saying whether or not supporting marriage equality or not is right or wrong. I'm merely pointing out that that objectively, these are the easier positions to take. These fights are easier because you will have considerable more institutional support. But where we've seen most progress over time, mostly is in the opposition to overt racism or overt homophobia or sexism. But the underlying structural inequalities remain largely intact to this day. When it comes to justice, Jesus doesn't call us to pick easy fights, to pick the heavy favorite, to bet on the Lakers who are playing right now against the Heat, for example. He wound up making enemies of the most powerful religious and secular leaders of his era. He picked difficult battles. He sided with people who were not easy to side with. He would dare associate with the pariahs of his time, Samaritans, prostitutes, tax collectors. He took on tough fights where he knew there would be heavy resistance with people with more support, more resources, more of the existing status quo behind them. The example of the rich man is admittedly an extreme one. It takes considerable faith to give up all your possessions. But it's actually plenty hard for people of privilege to be able to sacrifice even 1/100th of that. The question is, knowing that you are going to meet resistance in advocating for Black lives and liberation, for example, because the status quo of white supremacy, are you willing to forfeit something like privilege or short-term comfort for long-term Black liberation? And as we're about to transition to time of reflection, I wanted to re-highlight this verse that was in the passage and highlight a few key words in there. Disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. I think that these emotions are important to bring out here because he knows in this moment that he is not doing the right thing, and it burdens him. He's sad because he knows the cost now, what it takes, and he knows he isn't strong enough to pay it. This is an example of how following Jesus can be difficult in the road to justice, in the road for advocating for Black liberation. He asks us to be radically courageous, generous, and trusting in ways that can be hard for us to wrap our minds around. Have you had these moments in your life? Moments where you know you should have said something, know you should have done something, but you couldn't bring yourself to do it in that moment? And on the flip side, how did it feel in those moments where you could bring yourself to do the right thing, where you knew something was right, you knew it would be uncomfortable, you knew it would cost you, but you were willing to trust in the movement and in your passion in doing the right thing, you were willing to personally sacrifice something to make it happen? This giving until it hurts, being in solidarity beyond the limits of our comfort, that's the radical generosity and the radical ways which Jesus wants us to align with the marginalized. It's clear, research has shown, in the gospel, it is clear in stories that our comfort zones are too finite. They are not big enough to meet the need of structural inequality. So we need to be the ones that push our boundaries and push our comfort zones. You're allowed to still have some. Like, it's not like if I say you got to go kill somebody, you got to go do that. You're allowed to have limits for sure, but our comfort zone falls well short of that, just so we're clear. And so the reflection question as we wrap up now that I want us all to consider is, what are the costs of pursuing racial justice that challenge you? How do you feel called to meet them? So what would it look like as a follower of Jesus to side with Black liberation and stand up to institutions of power? And it doesn't have to look like, calling out everybody, like your friends and your family and strangers when they engage in racially dubious shenanigans. It could look like something else for you. Maybe the cost is the kind of job you take out of college. Maybe it's how or where you spend or give your money. Maybe it's the conversations you need to have with those around you. Maybe it's the neighborhoods you do or do not move into. For example, I could pay $700 less on rent, but then I would be contributing to gentrification, which is its own form of racial violence. So the more loving thing to do is move in this other neighborhood that I can afford to live in, so I do not displace a person of color. Maybe it's who or what you vote for. My taxes are going to go up if I vote for this, but I care enough about it where I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. If you had family that was alive in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement, statistically speaking, based on Gallup polls, there was a very good chance that they did not support the Civil Rights Movement. And that's a stance that did not age well within their lifetimes. I'm sure many of them lived with some regret for not being willing to pay whatever social or personal cost it would have taken for them to support that movement. Just as I imagine that perhaps that rich man may have lived out the rest of his days feeling regretful that he did not accept the invitation from Jesus. So how do we want to feel months from now, years from now, decades from now, when we reflect upon what we were and were not willing to do in moments like these? If we believe that standing on the side of justice is standing on the side of Jesus, do we have the faith that he will carry us through whatever we have to sacrifice? I'm done. Also, that's not a dramatic pause. That's it.
Thank you so much, Matt. It was great to hear that message from you. I feel very moved by it, and I know that many of us here do as well. I think for me, the kinds of situations you're describing are often the situations where I don't step up, where I'm the kind of person who won't speak up even if someone is being incredibly rude to me. And so I've been in those situations and then felt that inner tension of I should say something. And I feel very challenged. And I know that one thing that helps me is to be prepared ahead of time, to know ahead of time that I will speak up, that whatever the situation is, that this is part of my calling as someone that loves a God of justice and wants to see justice and rightness in our society. I know for many of us right now who are listening to this, it's a time when we just feel a lot of pressure and a sense of like things are just not going well. They're not going the way we want. We're tired. We're fatigued, both by the news and by the work that's coming our way. And the thing that I think we need to remember in this time is that we are actually sitting at a hinge point in history, that because of the chaos and everything that's going on, this is turning out to be a moment that's going to determine the future of America and also the rest of the world, other countries, in many ways going forward. And we have an opportunity to be part of shifting the culture and shifting the political conversation and the politics itself. And so this is a time for us, even though we have a lot going on, to be very thoughtful and intentional about how we engage with these issues. Just one verse to wrap this up. I was thinking about this as Matt was talking. This is from Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. And it says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. For it is..." Let's not grow weary. Let's not get tired of doing it. It's a tiring time, but let's not grow tired of doing good and doing what's right. And the promise here is that because God cares about good and justice, there will be a harvest. The seeds we plant will become ripe, and they will produce fruit in the long term. And so as we continue to reflect on the question that Matt put before us, let's be thoughtful about this. And I'm going to bring on a video from Ramelis Wilson, who is a friend of CCF, that he recorded for us to lead us into worship. And let's let the song remind us of the character of the God that we follow, a God who loves us and sees us and supports us even as we try to do hard things in our lives together. That we have a God who will sustain us through danger and through fear and through uncertainty, and yes, through tiring but important times. So let's engage with this together.
Hi, Comfort Christian Fellowship. So good to be back with you all. I'm going to lead us in this next song of worship. It's just called The Good Father. So if you know it, I encourage you to sing along with me. Amen. Thousand stories. And I've heard 1,000 stories of what they think you're like, but I've heard tender whisper of love in the dead of night, and you tell me that you're pleasing, that I'm never alone. You're a good, good father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. Oh, I've seen many searching for answers far and wide, but I know we're all searching for answers. Only you provide, because you know just what we need before we say a word. You're a good, good father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good, good father. Who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. So I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us, yeah. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. Love so undeniable, I can hardly speak. Peace so unexplainable I can hardly think as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still as you love. Love, love, you're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good, good Father. Who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. One last time, you are perfect. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you, Matt, for your talk. I have a lot to think about now. And I think one thing in particular that struck me was the idea that more rights for some group of people does not mean less rights for another. It's not pie. And I've seen this on Instagram too, but the idea of rights and the world being better for one group of people, making it better for everyone collectively is something I'm going to keep thinking about. And please join us for the post-CCF Hangout on Zoom. There will be a link in our private Facebook and also in the group chat. And we will have a Q&A with Matt for the first part of our Hangout. And we will be playing Among Us afterwards. So I hope you can all join us. Thank you and have a good Friday.